June 4, 1942, 10:22 p.m., 14,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding Scouting Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise, banked his SBD Dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree dive and pointed the nose directly at the Japanese carrier Kaga. The aircraft shuddered as airspeed built past 250 knots. Through the telescopic sight, McCluskey watched the carrier's deck expand, filling his vision with the organized chaos of aircraft being fueled and armed. The Dauntless wasn't fast, maximum speed 255 miles per hour, slower than most fighters. It wasn't heavily armed, 2 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns and a single rear-facing .30 caliber gun for the radio man gunner. It wasn't particularly maneuverable, large for a dive bomber, solid rather than agile. Japanese pilots called it the flying coffin. Japanese intelligence assessed it as obsolete, a pre-war design unsuited for modern carrier warfare. And McCluskey was about to drop a 1,000-pound bomb from 2,500 feet straight through Kaga's flight deck, detonating in the hangar where armed and fueled aircraft would turn the carrier into an inferno within minutes. The bomb hit, then others. Within 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, were burning, destroyed by SBD Dauntless dive bombers that Japanese naval doctrine had dismissed as negligible threats. The battle would continue for 2 more days, but the outcome was decided in those 6 minutes when obsolete American aircraft, operating beyond their designed combat radius, achieved hit rates exceeding 50% against maneuvering targets that represented the most modern carriers in existence. The story begins not with triumph at Midway, but with mockery in Tokyo intelligence briefings, where Japanese naval officers examined photographs of the SBD Dauntless and concluded the Americans had deployed a training aircraft to frontline carrier operations. The Douglas SBD Dauntless entered service with the U.S. Navy in 1940, designed by Ed Heinemann at the Douglas Aircraft Company as a replacement for the obsolescent Northrop BT-1. The aircraft represented conservative engineering rather than innovative design. Low-wing monoplane construction, fixed landing gear with aerodynamic fairings, 2-man crew, pilot and radio man gunner. Top speed 255 miles per hour at 14,000 feet. Service ceiling 25,530 feet. Range approximately 1,200 miles with standard fuel load. Armament consisting of 2 .50 caliber machine guns in the nose and 1 .30 caliber machine gun in the rear cockpit, plus 1 bomb mounted beneath the fuselage and 2 smaller bombs under the wings. The design prioritized stability and accuracy over speed and agility. The perforated dive brakes, large control surfaces, and structural reinforcement all served one purpose: allowing the aircraft to dive at steep angles while maintaining control, enabling the pilot to aim the aircraft like a gun and release ordnance with precision impossible for level bombers or torpedo aircraft. The Dauntless was optimized for one specific mission profile: dive to attack altitude, push over into a steep dive, release the bomb at minimum altitude, pull out and return to the carrier. Every design decision reflected this specialization. Japanese intelligence, analyzing photographs and intelligence reports about the Dauntless, identified multiple vulnerabilities. The aircraft was slow, making it vulnerable to fighter interception. The fixed landing gear increased drag and reduced performance. The bomb load was modest compared to torpedo bombers. The defensive armament was inadequate for self-protection. Japanese assessment concluded that the Dauntless represented an interim design, adequate for training and peacetime operations, but unsuited for combat against modern fighters and anti-aircraft defenses. The assessment was technically accurate, but operationally meaningless. The Dauntless wasn't designed to dogfight or to survive prolonged combat. It was designed to deliver bombs precisely onto point targets from dive attacks that minimized exposure time. And in that specific mission profile, the Dauntless was extraordinarily effective. The dive bombing technique that the Dauntless exemplified had been developed through the 1930s as navies recognized that level bombing from altitude rarely hit maneuvering ships. The mathematics was brutal. A bomb dropped from 10,000 feet took approximately 25 seconds to reach sea level. A ship moving at 20 knots traveled approximately 250 feet during that time. Accounting for wind, aircraft speed, and target maneuvers, hit probability for level bombing against warships was under 5%. Torpedo attacks achieved higher hit rates but exposed aircraft to concentrated anti-aircraft fire at low altitude. Dive bombing solved both problems. By releasing the bomb at low altitude during a steep dive, the pilot reduced the time between release and impact to approximately 5 seconds. The aircraft's dive angle meant the pilot could aim visually using the target itself as a reference, rather than relying on complex bomb sight calculations. And the attack profile, diving from altitude at high speed, made the aircraft difficult for anti-aircraft gunners to track and engage effectively. But dive bombing imposed severe structural loads. The dive subjected the airframe to forces exceeding 4 Gs. The pull-out of the dive imposed loads approaching 7 Gs. The dive brakes, extended during the dive to limit airspeed and improve control, created asymmetric forces that could tear control surfaces off improperly designed aircraft. Only aircraft specifically engineered for dive bombing could execute the maneuver safely and repeatedly. The Dauntless was engineered specifically for this mission. The airframe used redundant structural elements that maintained integrity even with battle damage. The dive brakes were perforated panels that deployed from the trailing edge of the wings, creating drag without producing dangerous vibrations. The control surfaces were large and powerful, allowing the pilot to maintain precise control even at the extreme angles and speeds characteristic of dive bombing. The landing gear, while creating drag that limited top speed, provided structural reinforcement that allowed the aircraft to withstand repeated high-G pullouts. Japanese carriers, by contrast, operated the Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber, an aircraft with retractable landing gear that achieved higher maximum speed but proved more fragile under combat stress. The Val was faster in level flight and more agile in maneuvering, but the Dauntless was more durable, more stable in dives, and more capable of absorbing battle damage and returning to the carrier. The design philosophies differed fundamentally. Japanese aircraft prioritized performance. American aircraft prioritized survivability. The Pacific War began on December 7, 1941. With Japanese carrier aircraft devastating the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The attack demonstrated Japanese naval aviation superiority in training, tactics, and operational execution. American forces, caught unprepared, suffered catastrophic losses. The Japanese Navy, having trained extensively for carrier operations and optimized aircraft designs for offensive warfare, appeared dominant across every measure of carrier aviation capability. The Dauntless participated in the Pearl Harbor defense, with pilots from Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 232 encountering Japanese aircraft during the attack. The encounters were brief and inconclusive, with Dauntless pilots discovering that their aircraft couldn't dogfight effectively against Japanese fighters. But the aircraft that survived returned to base despite battle damage, demonstrating the structural integrity that would prove decisive in subsequent engagements. The early carrier battles of 1942, Coral Sea in May and Midway in June, revealed the Dauntless's true capabilities. At Coral Sea, dauntless dive bombers from USS Lexington and USS Yorktown attacked the Japanese carrier Shōkaku, scoring multiple hits that sank the carrier within minutes. The attack demonstrated that dauntless dive bombers, if they reached attack positions unmolested by fighters, could destroy carriers through precision bombing that level bombers couldn't match. But Coral Sea also revealed vulnerabilities. Japanese fighters, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M-0, could intercept dauntless formations and inflict significant casualties. The slow speed and modest defensive armament meant that dauntless squadrons required fighter escort to survive transit to and from targets. Without an escort, losses were unsustainable. The aircraft's effectiveness depended entirely on achieving surprise or overwhelming local fighter opposition through coordination with escort fighters. Midway, 1 month after Coral Sea, demonstrated what coordinated dauntless attacks could achieve under optimal circumstances. American intelligence, having broken Japanese naval codes, knew the approximate location and composition of the Japanese carrier force approaching Midway. American carriers, positioned northeast of Midway, launched strikes coordinated to arrive over the Japanese fleet simultaneously, overwhelming defensive fighters and anti-aircraft fire through sheer numbers. The initial attacks failed catastrophically. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet, attacking without fighter escort, was annihilated by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. 15 aircraft were shot down. Only 1 pilot survived. Torpedo Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from USS Yorktown suffered similar losses. The slow, low-altitude torpedo attacks allowed Japanese fighters to intercept and destroy the attackers before they could launch torpedoes effectively. But the torpedo attacks accomplished something tactically significant. Japanese fighters, concentrated at low altitude destroying American torpedo bombers, were out of position when American dive bombers arrived at altitude. McCluskey's dauntless squadrons from Enterprise, diving from 14,000 feet, encountered minimal fighter opposition. The dive bombers pushed over into attack dives against carriers whose decks were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, being prepared for strikes against American carriers. The attack timing was coincidental rather than planned. McCluskey had searched for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, consuming fuel that would barely allow a return to Enterprise. He had decided to return when he spotted a Japanese destroyer heading northeast at high speed. Following the destroyer's course, he located the Japanese carrier force minutes before reaching the point where fuel constraints would force withdrawal. The subsequent attack achieved hit rates unprecedented in naval aviation. Enterprise dive bombers scored hits on Kaga and Akagi. Yorktown dive bombers hit Soryu. The bombs, penetrating carrier flight decks and detonating in hangars filled with armed aircraft, triggered secondary explosions and fires that destroyed the carriers within hours. Japanese damage control, optimized for rapid repair to restore flight operations, couldn't contain fires fueled by aviation gasoline and explosions from ordnance stored in hangars. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, survived the initial attack and launched a counterstrike against Yorktown. Japanese dive bombers hit Yorktown, inflicting damage that eventually contributed to the carrier's loss. But Hiryu was located and attacked by Enterprise dive bombers in the afternoon. Additional hits destroyed Hiryu, leaving the Japanese carrier force without operational carriers, while American forces retained 2 functional carriers. The Battle of Midway, decided by SBD Dauntless dive bombers, represented the turning point in the Pacific War. Japanese carrier aviation, having dominated the first 6 months of the war, lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of trained aircrew in one day. The strategic balance shifted from Japanese offensive operations to American counteroffensives that would continue for 3 more years until the Japanese surrender. Japanese post-battle analysis recognized that American dive bombers, dismissed as obsolete in pre-war assessments, had achieved tactical effectiveness that Japanese planners hadn't anticipated. The high hit rates, the precision that allowed attacks on specific carriers, and the timing that concentrated multiple squadrons over the target simultaneously all represented capabilities that Japanese intelligence had underestimated. The mockery stopped. The flying Coffin destroyed the most powerful carrier force in existence. The Dauntless continued operations through 1942 and 1943, participating in every major carrier battle. At Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Dauntless dive bombers damaged the Japanese carrier Ryujo. At Santa Cruz in October 1942, they damaged the carrier Shōkaku. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, they participated in strikes that destroyed multiple Japanese carriers and hundreds of aircraft. The aircraft that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as obsolete was systematically destroying the Japanese carrier fleet. The effectiveness derived from design characteristics that seemed like limitations. The slow speed that made the Dauntless vulnerable to fighters also made it stable during dives, allowing precise aiming. The fixed landing gear that increased drag also reinforced the airframe, allowing the aircraft to survive damage that would destroy faster, lighter aircraft. The conservative design that lacked innovation provided reliability that more advanced aircraft couldn't match. The Dauntless rarely achieved spectacular performance in any single category, but it consistently performed its primary mission, dive bombing, better than any contemporary aircraft. The production numbers were substantial. Douglas manufactured 5,936 SBD Dauntless aircraft between 1940 and 1944. The aircraft equipped U.S. Navy and Marine Corps squadrons throughout the Pacific, providing the primary carrier-based strike capability until being supplemented and eventually replaced by the more advanced SB-2C Helldiver in 1944. But pilots who flew both aircraft often preferred the Dauntless, citing its superior handling characteristics, reliability, and battle damage tolerance. The Dauntless's combat record was unmatched. American sources credit Dauntless dive bombers with sinking or damaging 18 Japanese warships, including 6 carriers, 14 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers and smaller vessels. Japanese losses to all causes during the Pacific War included 12 fleet and light carriers sunk. Dauntless dive bombers contributed to the destruction of 6 of those 12. The aircraft that Japanese pilots called the Flying Coffin had destroyed half the Japanese carrier fleet. The tactical doctrine that made the Dauntless effective was refined through combat experience. Early operations revealed that unescorted dive bombers suffered prohibitive losses to fighter interception. By 1943, American carrier operations integrated fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers into coordinated strike packages that overwhelmed Japanese defenses through simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Fighters engaged Japanese fighters and strafed anti-aircraft positions. Dive bombers attacked from altitude. Torpedo bombers attacked from low altitude. The coordination meant that Japanese defenses, concentrated against one attack element, couldn't effectively engage the others. The training that American dive bomber pilots received was extensive and realistic. Pilots practiced dive bombing against moving targets until achieving consistent accuracy. The training emphasized precision rather than survival, teaching pilots to maintain dives to minimum altitude, often below 2,000 feet, before releasing ordnance. This low release altitude maximized accuracy but exposed aircraft to intense anti-aircraft fire. The pilots who survived the training and early combat missions developed skills that Japanese pilots, trained primarily for dogfighting, couldn't match in precision bombing. The radio man gunner position, occupied by enlisted personnel, proved tactically significant. The rear-facing .30 caliber machine gun provided minimal protection against attacking fighters, but the radio man gunner served as observer, reporting fighter attacks and providing situational awareness that allowed pilots to maneuver defensively. The crew coordination, practiced extensively during training, meant that Dauntless crews operated as integrated teams rather than pilots with passengers. This crew resource management contributed to survival rates and operational effectiveness. The aircraft's limitations remained significant throughout its service life. The slow speed meant that Dauntless formations required fighter escort for survival. The modest bomb load meant that multiple hits were required to sink major warships. The range, while adequate for carrier operations, limited operational radius and forced pilots to balance bomb load, fuel, and safety margins when planning strikes. These limitations were recognized and accepted because the aircraft's strengths, precision bombing accuracy, structural integrity, and reliability, were decisive for carrier strike operations. The replacement of the Dauntless by the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver beginning in 1944 was controversial. The Helldiver offered improved performance, higher speed, greater bomb load, retractable landing gear, but proved more difficult to handle, less reliable, and less popular with pilots. Many squadrons preferred retaining the Dauntless despite its obsolescent design because the aircraft was familiar, reliable, and effective. The transition to the Helldiver was completed by late 1944, but pilots who had flown both aircraft often maintained that the Dauntless was the superior dive bomber for the mission profile it was designed to execute. The strategic impact extended beyond sunk carriers. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the losses at Midway. The carriers were eventually replaced, but the trained aircrew, pilots, observers, and aircrew who had practiced carrier operations for years before Pearl Harbor couldn't be replaced quickly. Japanese training programs, adequate for maintaining pre-war force levels, couldn't produce replacement pilots at rates sufficient to compensate for combat losses. By 1944, Japanese carrier air groups were staffed primarily by inadequately trained pilots who couldn't match American veterans in skill or experience. The Americans, by contrast, maintained training programs that produced pilots in quantities exceeding losses. The industrial capacity that produced thousands of Dauntless aircraft also supported training programs that produced thousands of pilots. By 1944, American carrier air groups included pilots with extensive combat experience leading squadrons of competent but less experienced pilots. The experience differential, combined with numerical superiority, meant that American carrier aviation dominated every engagement after Midway. The Dauntless contributed to this dominance not through revolutionary technology, but through reliable, effective execution of a specific mission. The aircraft sank carriers at Midway, disabled cruisers at Guadalcanal, destroyed infrastructure at Rabaul, and supported amphibious operations across the Pacific. The versatility, dive bombing precision against ships, close air support for ground forces, and reconnaissance made the aircraft valuable even as more advanced designs entered service. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to American dive bomber tactics. Japanese fighters could intercept dive bombers during transit, but once American aircraft entered dives, interception became nearly impossible. The high-speed dive, typically exceeding 250 knots, meant that fighters attempting to follow experienced dangerous control loads that could cause structural failure. Anti-aircraft fire, while dangerous, couldn't track targets in steep dives effectively. The defensive counter that worked, maintaining continuous fighter patrols at altitude over carrier formations, required resources that Japan couldn't sustain after Midway. The pilot who flew the Dauntless at Midway, who survived the war, who returned to civilian life and lived into old age, rarely spoke about the battle. The narrative that emerged, that obsolete American aircraft had defeated superior Japanese forces through luck and timing, bothered pilots who understood that success derived from training, tactics, and aircraft that performed exactly as designed under conditions that tested every design parameter. The Dauntless wasn't lucky. It was engineered for a specific mission and executed that mission effectively when given the opportunity. The flying coffin designation, applied by Japanese pilots who encountered the Dauntless and survived, reflected recognition that the aircraft was dangerous despite appearing obsolete. Japanese intelligence assessments that dismissed the Dauntless as inadequate for modern warfare proved catastrophically wrong because the assessments evaluated performance metrics, speed, agility, armament, that weren't decisive for dive bombing effectiveness. The metrics that mattered, dive stability, structural integrity, accuracy, were precisely the characteristics that the Dauntless emphasized over performance. The death ray never worked because physics imposed insurmountable constraints. The Bailey Bridge worked because engineering simplicity enabled rapid deployment. Napoleonic artillery worked because mathematical design beat traditional craft. Fuchs's espionage worked because ideology motivated betrayal that security systems couldn't detect. The Dauntless worked because conservative engineering focused on mission-specific capabilities produced an aircraft that, while unimpressive in general performance, was devastatingly effective in the single mission it was designed to execute. 78 years after Midway, historians still debate whether the battle represented a turning point or merely delayed the inevitable Japanese defeat. The debate misses the operational reality. American industrial capacity would eventually produce overwhelming numerical superiority regardless of tactical outcomes. But the pace of that buildup, the losses sustained during the buildup, and the strategic options available during the buildup all depended on whether Japanese carrier aviation remained intact or was destroyed at Midway. The SBD Dauntless, diving through defensive fire at 250 knots, determined which path history followed. The Japanese officers who laughed at photographs of the Dauntless in 1941 were dead or imprisoned by 1945. The carriers whose aircraft should have defended were on the ocean floor. The Navy they served had been destroyed by the same industrial and tactical systems that produced slow, ungainly dive bombers that seemed obsolete before the war began. And the lesson that operational effectiveness derives from executing specific missions successfully rather than achieving impressive general performance remained unlearned by military establishments that continued prioritizing measurable performance over mission-focused capability. The Dauntless flew its last combat mission in 1944, replaced by aircraft that were faster, more heavily armed, and more modern. The pilots who had flown the Dauntless through Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea moved on to other aircraft, other battles, other wars. The aircraft that had destroyed the Japanese carrier fleet was scrapped, forgotten, relegated to museums as an obsolete design from an earlier phase of the war, and the Japanese Navy, which mocked the flying Coffin in 1941, existed only in historical records by 1945, destroyed by the same aircraft their intelligence had dismissed as inadequate for modern warfare. The mockery ended somewhere over the Pacific in June 1942, replaced by the recognition that the slow American dive bombers were more dangerous than faster, more agile Japanese aircraft because they consistently hit what they aimed at. The flying Coffin ruined the Japanese Navy not through superior technology, but through the devastating simplicity of dropping bombs accurately from aircraft engineered specifically to enable that accuracy. And the pilots who flew the Dauntless at Midway understood what historians often missed, that wars are won by aircraft that perform their designed missions reliably, not by aircraft that achieve impressive performance in categories that don't matter when the bombs are falling.